I want to start off with a couple of thank yous. First, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here. Thanks to the team that helped put this on. I won't start naming names because I'm sure I'll leave people out. But certainly those of you that, everything from the folks who sent me emails and have done everything to make this happen, so thank you. The other thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge some things, some people. I recognize that when talking about spirituality or religion of any kind, that is a subject that carries a lot of baggage. It's a topic that a lot of us have been wounded around and with. And so I recognize that it takes a degree of trust in me for you to show up tonight. So I want to say thank you for that trust. And I want to do my best to honor that trust. To that end, if there's anything that I say that you feel like you need to be clarified, that you want me to clarify, if there's anything that I mention that doesn't sit right with you, I want you to feel free to interrupt me. Now, I haven't memorized the signs that you just talked about, but I think I'm familiar enough with them to recognize them. Anyway, if I see hands making any kind of a shape in the air, then I'll investigate. To that end, I think it's important to kind of begin with some things about who I am that might sort of help us have a little bit of a context. First, you heard the bit about me being ordained and the theologian and all that stuff. I jokingly say that I always feel like I'm being outed when people discover that part of my identity, because I certainly don't walk around with it in the way that some people do. Let me tell you what that means for me. What that means for me is that a particular community in Decatur, Georgia, said that they trust me to interpret the tradition as as I accompany them through the joys and the sorrows of their lives. It's a tremendous honor for me. For me, it's also the legacy of the way I learned how to struggle. A lot of those lessons I learned in my grandmother's church, when I learned that the injustices that she talked to me about were not just wrong or illegal, but they were evil. And so I grew up with a certain language, with a certain way of interpreting reality. And I embrace that tradition, and that's the tradition that I try to live out and carry. So one of the things that I think that's important for me to point out, and it's something that it's honestly sometimes a point of frustration living in Europe. Let me be very clear. I am a descendant of people who endured slavery by Christians, who endured lynchings by Christians, who endured all sorts of atrocities from European descendant Christians. And I am a queer identified person who's dealt with hell from Christians. And so the reason why that's important for me to point out is because it can be sometimes frustrating when people talk to me as if I don't know my own history, or presume that if I'm a person of faith, it must be because some kind of a delusion or denial. it's important to always remember that if you hear history only being told from the perspective of the powerful, and if you hear history robbing the victims of that history of their agency, then you ought to ask more questions, right? So, what Black theology is about is it was about sort of asking those questions. It was about the fact that my ancestors heard this story that the white slavers wanted them to hear, but they heard something else. They heard the story of an innocent man being beaten and spat upon and killed, and yet that this man was called the Son of God, and that this man, that wasn't the last word in history, that there was hope, that there was some other power that was on the side of this man, and that filled them with hope, and that became the language, the rather coded language that they would use to fight for their emancipation, freedom, and so on and so forth. And so that's sort of a beginning point, for me at least, when I talk about, when I think about spirituality and social movements. Now, I know that it's popular and important in many ways to separate spirituality from religion. And I know that what I'm talking about right now might sound a little bit like both. That's because it is. Because I like to use an expression that Howard Thurman, who was a theologian, a very important organizer in the Black freedom struggle in the U.S. I like to use an expression that he used that he used to use. He talked about religious experience. Now, religious experience, I think, is something that most of us might think of today as spirituality. But when we talk about the religious experience of African peoples in the United States, it's that religious experience that became the source and substance of their resistance. Let me stop there, let me pause there and see if there are any initial clarifying questions. Okay. So, it's about to be April. I'm going to take us back to history for a second. So, the two people who I named in my little introductory speech, let me tell you a little bit about them so that you know who they are. Vincent Harding was my closest mentor. He was a dear friend of Dr. King. He was a historian. He had he was a Pan-Africanist. He was deeply committed to the global struggle for freedom. Dr. Harding used to, he's well known, he's principally known for being a speechwriter for Dr. King on occasion. He drafted Dr. King's speech when he declared his opposition to the Vietnam War. The other person that I mentioned, Ruby Sales, who's still living, was a 16-year-old girl volunteering for SNCC. And do I need to explain what SNCC is? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC was critical component of the black freedom struggle in the United States. And let me explain something. That my elders don't really like to call that the civil rights movement. They will to help people understand what they're talking about, but they often, Dr. Harding especially, would always say civil rights is too narrow an expression to describe what they risked and gave their lives for. They prefer to say the freedom movement, the Southern freedom movement, the black freedom movement, but it wasn't simply something to be confined to civil rights. Ruby Sales was a 16-year-old girl in Alabama, in Lowndes County. Amanda, something that you where'd Amanda go? Something that you probably appreciate knowing. Do you know anything else of particular history that maybe Emory Douglas may have talked to you about in Lowndes County, Alabama?
No. Yeah. No.
It's okay. It's all right. So that's also important. Lowndes County has also become an important place for the Black Panther Party. But that's another story. Mother Sales, Ruby and others were registering voters. They were arrested, put in jail. After they came out of jail, and I should warn you, I'm about to describe a violent event. After they came out of jail, they went to they were just released. They were walking. They went into a convenience store to get some water. Ruby was there with a white Episcopal seminary student named Jonathan Daniels. The store owner saw Ruby walk in the door and said, I'm just going to say, okay, so this is going to be violent language, but I'm just going to say it. He said, nigga, I will blow your brains out. And he pulled a shotgun and he pulled the trigger. Jonathan Daniels jumped in front of Ruby and his face was blown off. So Jonathan Daniels is now a patron saint in the Episcopal Church of the United States. Ruby went on to continue to be a freedom fighter and continues to this day. She was one of the first people talking about the problem of these police killings in the U.S. These are the people, these are the stories that shaped and helped define my life in many ways. And all of them have in common this profound faith, this profound hope, this profound something that keeps them moving. And I mean, Ruby couldn't speak she lost her ability to speak for several years after that. And so I was always struck by this. And in some ways, there's a kind of everyday courage that I saw all around me with my grandparents and so on and so forth. But I've always been struck, what is this thing what kind of strength is it that gives people the ability to not only to keep going, but to keep going with such hope, with such love. I'm going to stop there, and then I want to bring us to 1968, April 4th, when Dr. King was killed. Now, at the end of the evening, I'm going to play a song. Now, Dr. King's favorite song was Precious Lord. It was an old spiritual. But he loved the jazz rendition played by a man named Ben Branch. And when he was at the Lorraine Motel, preparing to stand with the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, Ben Branch was getting out of his car, and Dr. King, who was in his hotel room, sees Ben and leans over and says, "Hey, you're going to play my song tonight at a rally." And that's when Dr. King was shot. Now, after this happened, Dr. King's friend and teacher and mentor, the great mystic theologian Howard Thurman, was traveling in Ghana at the time. So some of you may know that there was a lot of cross movement between the African liberation struggles and the Black freedom struggle in the United States, right? So there's lots of movement, dialogue, conversation back and forth. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the great liberation leader of what was then the Gold Coast, had studied at a historically Black college in the United States, Lincoln University, had organized with had made contact with the Trotskyists, Grace Lee Boggs and Jimmy Boggs, who were profound organizers in Detroit. There was this fertile pollination that was happening all over the world at that time. Howard Thurman, right after King's assassination, is in Ghana, and he's asked to give a radio broadcast to the United States from Ghana. And I'm going to play that radio broadcast right now. Now, by I mean Elisa is going to help me play the radio broadcast. Now, after, you'll have to listen carefully. It's clear, but Dr. Thurman is a profound brother. He's very, so even for me, for whom English is a mother tongue, you'll have to listen carefully. Thank you.
Martin Luther King Jr. is dead. This is the simple and utter fact. A few brief hours ago, his voice could be heard in the land, from the ends of the earth, from the hearts of our cities, from the firesides of the humble and the mighty, from the cells of 1,000 prisons, from the deep central place in the soul of America, the cry of anguish can be heard. There are no words with which to eulogize this man. Martin Luther King was the living epitome of a way of life that rejected physical violence as the lifestyle of a morally responsible people. His assassination reveals the cleft deep in the psyche of the American people, the profound ambivalence and ambiguity of our way of life. Something deep within us rejects nonviolent direct action as a dependable procedure for effecting social change. And yet, against this rejection, something always struggles, pushing, always pushing, with another imperative, another demand. It was King's fact that gave to this rejection flesh and blood, courage and vision, hope and enthusiasm. For indeed in him the informed conscience of the country became articulate. And tonight, what many of us are feeling is that we, all of us, must be that conscience wherever we are living, wherever we are functioning, and wherever we are behaving. Perhaps his greatest contribution to our time and to the creative process of American society is not to be found in his amazing charismatic power over masses of people, nor is it to be found in his peculiar and challenging courage with its power to transform the fear-ridden black men and women with a strange new valor, nor is it to be found in the gauntlet which he threw down to challenge the inequities and brutalities of a not quite human people, but rather in something else. Always he spoke from within the context of his religious experience, giving voice to an ethical insight which sprang out of his profound brooding over the meaning of his Judeo-Christian heritage. And this, indeed, is his great contribution to our time. He was able to put at the center of his own personal religious experience a searching ethical awareness. Thus, organized religion as we know it in our society found itself with its back against the wall. To condemn him, to reject him, was to reject the ethical insight of the faith it proclaimed. And this was new. Racial prejudice, segregation, discrimination were not regarded by him as merely un-American, undemocratic, but as mortal sin against God. For those who are religious, it awakens guilt. For those who are merely superstitious, it inspires fear. And it was this fear that pulled the trigger of the assassin's gun that took his life. Tonight there is a vast temptation to strike out in pain, horror, and anger. Riding just under the surface are all the pent-up fury, the accumulation of generations of cruelty and brutality. A way must be found to honor our feelings without dishonoring him whose sudden and meaningless end has called them forth. May we harness the energy of our bitterness and make it available to the unfinished work which Martin has left behind. It may be, it just may be, that what he was unable to bring to pass in his life can be achieved by the act of his dying. For this, there is eloquent precedence in human history. He was killed in one sense because mankind is not human yet. May he live because all of us in America are closer to becoming human than we ever were before. I express my deep compassion for his wife, his children, and his mother, his father, and his brother. May we all remember that the time and the place of a man's life on the earth are the time and the place of his body. But the meaning of his life is as vast, as creative, and as redemptive as his gifts, his time, and the passionate commitment of all his powers can make it. Our words are ended, and for a long, waiting moment, the rest is silence.
So I think I'd like us to take a break now. But before we take a break, I want us to come back to a place of discussion. I recognize that I'm drawing from my own context and experience and religious tradition to talk about spirituality and to talk about spirituality and the impact of spirituality in social movements. But I recognize that my tradition is not everybody's tradition, right? And my context is not everybody's context. This is not the United States. But I think that there are some quite universal qualities of religious experience. And I think that there's something about the capacity for religious experience to create a space within us for a kind of transcendent ethical insight. That doesn't mean that it's always the case. Obviously, the world is replete with examples of religious experience that don't seem to have shit to do with ethical insight. Right? But I want that sort of statement / question to be a conversation point when we get back from the break. So I wanted to name it now and allow us to break. Okay? Thank you. What I'd actually like you to do is to split yourselves up into, let's say, groups of 4, if that's possible. Obviously, if the numbers don't work out, then just add a person, whatever. If you could talk in your group of 4 about, let me frame it in a question. I think that will make it easier. I feel like there are 2 questions.
That's okay.
What do you think religious experience is? 1. 2. How can it produce ethical insight?
Can we extend religious experience to spiritual experience for the first part of your question? Because there may be people here who aren't religious and aren't familiar with what a religious experience might be.
I think your question actually contains a response to mine in a way. Yes. Okay, so groups of 4, please. This is going to be a 10-minute discussion. Let me just get some answers for the good of the whole. So, how did we define religious experience?
Raise your hand. The mic will come to you. No,
How did we define religious experience?
And we kind of agreed that a religious experience is the same as a spiritual experience, only with a set of rules.
What else did other people say? How did you define a spiritual experience? Well, can I put you on the spot?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, our discussion mainly revolved around the idea of spirituality. And we're trying to kind of come to terms with how we're defining a religious experience. But of course, religion being something that's practiced, or somewhat the pursuit of spirituality with practices that inform that journey. But for me at least, is that they're not mutually exclusive, but you can have spirituality without religion. And we kind of also grappled with the idea of religion not being the only path to coming to terms with an ethical realization. So the idea that an ethical life is a life of continuous reflection, and that spirituality and religion being paths in which you can continuously reflect on your life, but not being the only path to realizing an ethical life.
It's a lot of agreement with that. Yeah, I can do that too. I mean, yeah, that sounded like I was being sarcastic. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that.
Okay. Yeah, so we kind of concluded with the quote of Reza Aslam, who said, religion is the language of spirituality. So that kind of, it can be from how do you materialize kind of your spiritual beliefs or feelings, I guess, or experience. Which also means that religion does not immediately mean the institutionalized religion that people often see or criticize, but religion can just simply be the way you materialize your spirituality or express your spirituality.
Is anyone, Krishna? In the back.
I threw into the pot that I thought spirituality was having faith, and religion was just the upside of that, because to have faith to get up in the morning when your best friend is dying, or help somebody when you know it's a useless act, but you want to do something, is expressing a spiritual faith of some sort, that things are going to be okay, that they're going to get better, because it gives you the energy to do normal things when there's awful things going on around you.
So, thank you. A lot of what you said resonates with me, and I realize that for some of the very reasons you named, that you know, a lot of times when I say religious experience, I mean spiritual experience. You know, for me, a lot of this is about sort of language and tradition of articulating dissent, right? Part of it is also about consciousness and awareness. You know, we mentioned Rastafari. Did many of you know much about Rastafari? Just a show of hands. I know that most people associate it with Bob Marley, which is the most famous Rasta by all means. You know, when Rastas were first starting, you know, rude boys in Jamaica were killed for locks. It was such a threat to the middle class establishment of Jamaican society. Right? Rastafari really could not have begun without Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey was a man from Montego Bay. I think he's from Montego Bay. Yeah. And Garvey was he did something really profound when he told Jamaicans and black people in the United States and all over the world, he said, Europeans have imagined God in their own image for centuries. It's time that we black people start to imagine God in ours. And that was the beginning of a revolution of consciousness for many black people who had not only, I mean, can you imagine what it means to not only, to live in the context of white supremacy sort of daily in terms of segregation and so on, but to also think that God is right. Right? Right, but that's real. But that's real. And for Marcus Garvey to say that was such this revolution of consciousness. Malcolm X's father was a Garveyite. That's how Brother Malcolm at least began learning a little bit about black consciousness. Right? The idea that when one encounters a fact, a truth, when one has an experience, that revolutionizes one's consciousness and sense of the world and life and people around them, I think of that as a religious experience. I think of it as a spiritual experience. And it can happen in the middle of a demonstration. It can happen while ordering coffee. It certainly can happen while reading a book. It might happen during sex. I think that there are these times in our lives where we come face to face with something that clearly sends us in this direction towards liberation. And my theology is such that I see that as God breaking into history and saying, look. So that's a lot of what I mean when I think of religious experience or spiritual experience. And I'll try to start saying spiritual experience for the rest of the night, because I realize that, again, because of all the pain of religion, it can be distracting to even use that word, right? So I'll say spiritual experience. What are your reactions to my saying that? Does that resonate as true with you? Does that? Yeah?
I think I feel you up until the moment you say it's God. Right. I'm with you. Like, my body feels you. Then you say God, and I'm like, and not to destroy. Like, I think there's profound something that I don't have a word for. I don't want to call it spiritual, but there's a profound something that definitely happens when you see the world and you're like, fuck. Like, deeply, from a deep place, like, shit, fuck. And I'm going to do something about that. Me. Like, I'm going to do something about that. And I'm going to stand with you, and we're going to do something about that. Not God. You and me. Right? And that's it. And it happens. It happens when I'm sitting down and I'm reading. The most recent experience for me, I was reading Paul Lefebvre, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I was like, speak. Like, I hear you speak. Right? Or I listen, like, as you're talking, I feel my body, and I'm like, that's spiritual, as you say. But that's not called God. That's not called God.
I feel you. So, thank you. Anyone else? I'll just say, I think sometimes for me, this is more confessional than anything else. God, when I say God, it's me being lazy. it's partly just, it's me using traditional language to describe something that is indescribable. But I'm being lazy. Hmm?
Feels it, knows it. I mean, there are certain things you cannot explain how you feel, and it's very difficult
Can
to
you,
put them
sorry
into
to...
So I'll just repeat. I think the microphone is going to be too hard to get over to Mandy. But what Mandy was saying was that who feels it knows it, and there are certain experiences that are hard to explain but can be felt. Yeah. So here's my next question, because there are two different aspects of this, right? On one hand, I think the most important question for us in this room is, how can this experience sustain us? You know, Uncle Vincent, Dr. Harding used to talk about, it was among the last things he said to me publicly at an event. We were celebrating, he was with Andrew Young and Dorothy Cotton at an event, and we were honoring all three of them. And, you know, they're all in their 80s. And he says, you know, you have to look around and see that the people that you're with, you want to be in the struggle with for 80 years or for 60 years, and so on and so forth. And, you know, for me, since all of these were also friends of Dr. King, I thought to myself, you know, an assassin may take your life when you're in your 30s, but you have to be prepared to struggle for the long haul, right? Because there's that much work to do, right? So how might this encounter with that other, that thing that we feel, like how might that sustain us?
I'm going to speak really quickly because I think I would but maybe you can speak like that. So fast. Thank you. I want to say, because this is a really interesting question, but I'm still stuck on your previous two questions.
Okay.
And I'm really still stuck on religious and religion. And because you have your background in organized religion, in Christianity, in black, in the black church, if I can call it that way, I'm so interested in why did you ask those questions, and where do you think is the potential for religious spirituality to, you know, in your experience and in your knowledge, to create, like, why did you ask us those questions, and what is to you an ethical sense? Because that's something that, you know, when we were discussing, got questioned a lot. And because there is so much pain, because there is so much evidence to the contrary. So could you speak a little bit more to that before we move on to the next question, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So for me, I think part of the reason why I asked the question is because for me they are a little bit difficult to separate. When we talk about religion, you know, you have to sort of, you know, from let's take the Bible, for example. Okay, the Bible is in some ways a horribly oppressive book, right? The God referenced, there are actually multiple gods referenced in the Hebrew scriptures, right? In the ancient texts, the most ancient texts, and the stories are stories of genocide and just all this horrible shit. But the Black theological tradition says that when you read the totality of the text, we see something that James Cone calls the scandal of particularity. And it's that God chose repeatedly to side with marginalized people, consistently. God is telling the stories of the widows and the orphans. God is choosing this minor power among ancient kingdoms to speak to the world. God is making these sort of radical choices. And that if we want to see the prerogative of the divine, the prerogative of God, then we have to look at that scandal of particularity. So what Cone does is he says, in 1980 when he wrote his famous book, when he published his most famous book that made everybody go apeshit, was he said Jesus is black. He says Jesus is black because Jesus was a Jew, living under Roman occupation, a Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation, right? And so if you want to see Jesus' social location today, Jesus is black. So for me, I can't like that. How can I separate spirituality from religion and all that, you know? I can't, you know, the songs that we sing in the Black church tradition, I mean, it's all there together. Like, so, you know, there's a John Mbiti, the South African theologian, he compares what he calls the African theological or cosmological sense to the more Western, the European cosmological sense. He frames it in reference to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. What Mbiti says is that the African answer to that has always been, I am because we are. Right? And so I can't extricate myself completely in a way that I have an individual spirituality apart from the community that produced me. So it's I believe in separation from health, for health. I ain't gonna let them beat me up and call me faggot and tell me I'm going to hell and all that shit. No, that's not gonna happen. But I don't know. I can't simply extricate my spirituality from religion.
I was just wondering if you think that when the African diaspora was sort of forced to go to Northern America, and after so many years, maybe they have appropriated the rules of another religion, and perhaps that is due to the fact that they have sort of lost their common own culture coming from Africa, or perhaps, I was just wondering whether there are practices in that church that are related to the actual African culture. Yeah,
absolutely.
You could talk more about that.
Well, I mean, there are lots of different. I mean, in some ways, I think you see this all over the Americas in general, and so one thing to point out is that some people talk about the fact that in some parts of Africa there was already a story that sounded very similar to the Christian story, and so it made it easily sort of compatible. So there's that aspect. And then there's the other thing. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I feel like it's important to always remember the resilience and the capacity for resistance of people, right? And so, you know, of course our ancestors were not allowed to do a lot of things, right? We had to change our names, we lost our languages, and so on and so forth. But a lot did survive, and for what made black church life so important in the United States is that those were the only institutions that we controlled. Like, the only institutions that we controlled. And so that sort of religious space became sacred for multiple reasons. It was, you know, it wasn't just that it was religious. Those were our banks. That's when we came when we needed money. Those were everything was in that space. And of course, I think we also held on to traditions that were Africans. If people look at the worship services, certain aspect of the worship service that you can anthropologically link to practices in different spaces. I mean, it's a complicated story because the cultural, linguistic, and ethnic traditions of the enslaved who were brought to the Americas are diverse, right? And so there's a diverse set of experiences that do sometimes become sort of melded and molded. And so the experience Louisiana and Mississippi, where the French were trading, looks a little bit different than the experience in Georgia and the Carolinas, where the British were trading. Trading is too polite. Committing atrocities. So yeah, that's all that's sort of wrapped up in. So for me, it's literally very hard to kind of just, you know, for me to walk away from that would be to walk away from too much, you know. I just, you know, growing up, one of the favorite songs that we used to sing, it goes, I'll try to sing it for you, just briefly, okay, so bear with me. We're crossing over one by one, don't let the men buy the Savior. Don't let them catch you, don't let them catch you with your work undone. We're crossing over one by one, crossing over. So like, that song, you metaphorically, it's referencing crossing over the great river Jordan to heaven. It's coded text. It's a runaway slave song. It's communicating to everyone around us when we're leaving. We're crossing over one by one. Don't let the men by the Savior catch you with your work undone. We're leaving at night after work is done, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's so much of our story that's wrapped up in our religious experience that it's hard for me to let go of it. Krishna?
Okay, Lucas, I know that you're American and you're Christian, and I just want to be inclusive.
Yes.
So I'm not a Christian, I'm not American, and I'm not black, but I come from a country where religion has oppressed people all the time just by being a religion. That's Hinduism, because it has a caste system, and it puts people from a lower caste, from the same religion, down. So I just want to say that sometimes religion is born out of revolution, because in the 1800s in India, the British and the Mughals were fighting over a country where my family come from. And all the people who weren't from the caste and who weren't Muslims had this spirituality of gathering and singing songs about revolution, about being free. about being not British and not being Muslim, just being people. And they started killing us in droves, especially the women and the children, because that made the blokes really pissed off. And out of that developed a religion called Sikhism, and I'm a Sikh. And as they were lining us up and killing us, the religion became stronger and stronger because it wasn't the dogma of Hinduism or of Islam. In the Second World War, when the British were driven out, Sikhs are 2% of the Indian population, and they were 90% of the dissidents that were caught and executed because they were active. So dogma comes from religion that needs births, deaths and marriages, rituals to sanctify control over land and property and people. And sometimes religion can be a freeing thing because it's about spirituality and wanting to belong to each other when it comes to a revolution to fight and gather people around. Like the University of Colour is a small spiritual group that we're hovering around to try and create change against policy that's happening. So I just wanted to be inclusive by saying that I know it's a Christian ethic that we're talking about, but that Christianity is this much of the population of the planet.
Thank you, Krishna. And to that end, I have to apologize. I'm not intending to talk about a Christian ethic. I'm intending to use my experience to talk about an ethic that I hope is more universal than that. And I feel like you've given us an illustration. But nonetheless, I need to apologize because we're about out of time, and I had every intentions of being more inclusive tonight, and I realize that I've monopolized the conversation with a very Christian-centric conversation, so I'm sorry for that. So 10 minutes. So we have 10 more minutes left in the conversation. Is there any thoughts, any other thoughts, reflections, comments, like in the community?
It's just touching upon the whole concept of deriving strength from religion or spirituality. In history, we studied the Haitian Revolution, and we learnt about Buchmann, who was a religious leader, who convinced the Haitians who were enslaved, they were enslaved Africans, that they were invincible, and that gave them the strength to overcome and fight against the French and eventually gain, they were emancipated in 1804, and I think they became free then as well, just as a country. So I quite liked that, and I thought that was something that would be nice to share. It was Voodooism, by the way, it wasn't Christianity.
Yeah, I think a big part of spiritual experience can be derived from empathy and love with your comrades, people who struggle with you.
But Charlie's saying a big part of spiritual experience can be derived from empathy and being with your comrades and the love that comes from being together in spaces. I agree.
Yeah, I have a question because earlier in your talk you mentioned the conception of good and evil. And I know for myself those are words that sometimes I use, but then thinking about it, I don't actually have a conception of what that is because I'm not a spiritual person at all. To me, it's very much aligns with my ideas of what is oppressive and liberating, so it's very much my reality. So I was wondering whether you could maybe elaborate on how you see good and evil.
I mean, so for me, I'm very sparse with the word evil. And to me, evil is something that's beyond bad. So the death of a child, the killing of a child, the shooting of Tamar Rice, leaving Michael Brown's body in the street is evil. And evil's opposite, for me, is not good, but holy or sacred. And those brave and courageous people in Ferguson, those women in Nigeria who stood up to demand justice for their daughters, that's sacred, that's holy. That's the way I see it.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to say something that you made me think of. I wasn't raised religiously either, but to me, religion and spirituality is about like finding your own way by which you perceive the world, basically, which doesn't need to be spiritual, but I think therefore spirituality is a very strong force, and it can give you perspective, and it can help you to think about things in a way that you might otherwise not do. And I think it's also about a connectedness, feeling like you belong, and I think that is something that can be used for good, because I agree with Tara that good and evil is like what is good, what is evil. But it can also be abused and use innocent people to for between quotation marks, like, or between evil means. So I think, because also about what you said about spirituality or God siding with marginalized people, that is the thing that I find hardest to understand, because when I look at the world, it seems that people who are not marginalized are constantly rewarded for it. So in that way, I feel like religion and strength that can come with religion is something that is needed most by people who are marginalized. I think this is not a very coherent story. Okay, so yeah, I think that you were being inclusive, because you were talking about, like, you were emphasizing your own personal, that it was your own personal belief and that you come from a background. And I think it's good that people also say that religion and spirituality can be used to do things that might seem like against the foundation of that spirituality.
Just so you guys know, we only have 4 more minutes left until we need to stop.
Yeah, I'll
Okay?
keep it short as I am. You were referring to the African proverb of I am, thus we are. In what ways can an individual experience with spirituality be reflected upon the crowd without it being used in a way that is a part of the individual experience, and that is used in a way to maybe commodify it, or used in a way to not reach for other people their potential to reach the same kind of spirituality, but just to repeat it? In what kind of ways can we, can the person that had a kind of spirituality that made an impact in her or his life, or whoever's life it can be, without it coming over to other people by getting it in the way that the person had it,
So, in what ways can the other people learn from the individual experience without it being exactly the same, but being useful in their own kind of living?
I mean, I think that religious experience can be shared, or spiritual experiences can be shared, and I think spiritual experiences, I mean, because we're all distinct, we all have different angles to it, but I think that one can have a religious experience and share that, one can have a spiritual experience. Spiritual experiences can happen to multiple people at the same time. That's one thing. Spiritual experiences can happen to an individual that person can then share the lessons and the insights from that within the context of a group. And I think that is good and should be done. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Let's have a round of applause and then put it on.